Welcome to Spinning Back Clique, where each week here at MMA Junkie, we take a quick spin through the biggest stories in MMA. On today's episode, Kayla Harrison versus Holm at UFC 300. I'm not messing around. Frankie Edgar, he's going to go into the Hall of Fame in 2024. Way to go, answer. Jon Anik was not too pleased with some MMA fans after the Strickland DDP fight. We're going to cover that as well. Gorgeous George here on the con. And look at the distinguished panel we have for you today. SBC creator and MMA Junkie Radio co-host goes. He's in Las Vegas. Nolan King, the Boston shot caller. He's back. He's in Boston. And the MMA media titan comes back. Mike Bond. He joins us from Toronto. Cold Coffee is going to be on the ones and twos. But before we get started, if you would kindly hit that like button, you'd make this jolly 49ers fan happier than he already is. The algorithm, baby. All right. So, yes, Kayla Harrison versus Holm at UFC 300. Can you believe it? The former PFL two-time champion Harrison has signed on with the UFC and has already been booked versus the former UFC bantamweight champion at bantamweight. There is a lot to unpack here. Let's get started with your initial reaction to this signing, for this free agent signing, I should say, for the UFC. What grade would you give it? We're using the ABCDF system. Nolan, get started.
Oh, this is an A for sure. In a division that needs talent, it needs excitement, it needs somebody to come in and shake things up. Kayla Harrison signing gives us a ton of options going forward. And when this was announced, I couldn't help but think, like, this had to have been one of the more shocking, out of left field sort of breaking news announcements that we've had in a long time, particularly in the good news department, right? Like, maybe the last one like this was when Michael Chandler came over from Bellator. But even with that, we had a little bit of an idea that it might happen, it could happen, and then it ended up happening. This, I mean, nobody saw this coming, right? A lot of us thought that Kayla Harrison seemingly had one more fight. There was a little under contract with PFL. There was a little bit of confusion about what her exact contract status was. But this was kept totally under wraps until Dana White announced the fight and the signing in one of his breaking news videos. And so to me, it certainly was that little bit of spice that I think UFC 300 needed. Do we have more spice? Does it need more spice going forward? Yes, but I think it adds that element of randomness out of left field, that sort of thing that we saw with, a Brock Lesnar sort of fight in the past, those sort of elements that make 300 special. So as a supporting act against Holm, who I actually find to be a very intriguing, difficult fight for Kayla Harrison, I give this signing a huge A. I think it was great for the UFC. It was great for the division. Obviously, a huge blow to PFL. They built her over the span of 17 fights into a pretty notable name, a superstar of sorts. And so now, certainly the training wheels are off. We've seen her lose in PFL. She left behind the Larissa Pacheco matchup. She leaves behind the Cyborg fight, if that was going to ever happen. But it opens up doors to fights that we never knew would happen, and it could not come at a better time. And who knows? Will this twist Amanda Nunes' arm into coming back as well? So, A, signing by the UFC. I'm excited to see what she does at 135 in a division that really, really, really needs a little bit of excitement right now.
All right. And goes, did this kind of remind you of, I think you were at UFC 199 when all of a sudden that whole thing went down with Lesnar's coming to the UFC? Was it that type of a hit for you from out of left field, like Nolan said?
Yes and no. So I got to actually give Mike some props because Mike said it on one of our SBCs, or I can't remember when he said it, but he did kind of remind everyone, like, don't forget her contract is up. And she may have that option. We didn't really think it would happen because all of the things that had been laid out up until this moment didn't really say she's going to the UFC. First of all, I do want to say I do agree with Nolan. It's an A signing. I mean, this is a girl that can headline a card, and at the same time, you weaken your opponent, right? They just took one from you and Francis Ngannou. Granted, this isn't to that level, but it's a shot back. But it's very difficult to unpack for those reasons. Like, you have to kind of put this all in perspective. Like, here's the one thing that we've heard over and over in this process between Kayla Harrison and Chris Cyborg is they all say the same thing, both of them. She doesn't want to fight me, right? And now we get them both under the same umbrella, and Kayla leaves. And it's kind of strange because she said it before to us, George, in our interviews. It's not really about the money. So if it's about competition, if it's about legacy, I feel like maybe in the PFL, you could have got more of that. Really, what I think is at the end of the day, she probably could have got both. I feel like if you feel like you could have beat her, fight Chris Cyborg, beat her, go back, avenge your loss with Larissa Pacheco, and then maybe you have that option to go to the UFC because PFL seems pretty reasonable when it comes to letting fighters do that. I'm not saying they're going to let her fight in the UFC and come back, but I'm pretty sure if she said, look, I can give you 2 fights, they're pretty big fights, but then I want to be a free agent again, I think eventually they probably could have came to some kind of terms. Or if not, maybe a couple more and then go to the UFC, and now your stock is so much higher. But her kind of taking off for the UFC, I think we just need to hear more from her and hear what her stance was and why she decided to do that. The path to the title in the UFC, it's probably not going to be a long one as it would be for other fighters, but it's tough, you know? It's just as tough. And like as Nolan said, I'm actually kind of surprised that they gave her Holly Holm because Holly Holm is a woman that's been in this exact same position before. And what did she do? So we'll have to see. You know, right now I think it's an A signing, but if things don't go Kayla's way early on, it's not gonna be an A signing anymore.
Mm-hmm. All right, and before we get to Mike's take, I do have what we have heard out of Kayla Harrison from her Instagram. It's quick. She says, "When I started competing, my goal was to be the best, the Olympic champion of MMA. The UFC presents me with the opportunity to be just that. It's an amazing journey to reach at this point, and I'm grateful for every step along the path. The highs and lows have shaped me and made me an even better version of myself. God's timing is perfect, and I'm sure of one thing, my time is now. Let's go." How about you, Mike, man? What was your reaction and everything that comes with it? You know, it's UFC 300, former champ, 135. Holy cow, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, definitely a lot of layers to this one. I was, a mix of excited and maybe a little disappointed, just on the disappointed end, starting there, I guess, because we won't get those fights with Chris Cyborg specifically. I could give or take the Larissa Pacheco one. We've seen that 3 times, but maybe to see if either Pacheco could have evened up that series at 2-2 or Kayla could have closed the door and avenged, I guess, that last loss in their most recent fight. But I don't think she desperately needs those fights. The Cyborg one is one that definitely we were building towards, and as Go's kind of laid out there, made a lot of sense, more so than ever, with both of them being under the same banner, but they weren't really under the same banner. Go's alluded to it there too. Like when I spoke to Kayla after her PFL championship win at the final event in November, whenever it was, she said, my contract is done. It's technically running till the end of the year, but it was 30 days or so away from being wrapped up, and she was not ruling out completely going to the UFC. She knew that it seemed like the biggest fight with Cyborg was there in front of her, but she said, I'm going to let my team handle it and whatever they deem best. And this is clearly the path they deemed best. And for the UFC, I think this is a huge win. I mean, we were talking on the show last week about after Raquel Pennington's win, just what are they going to do with this division? It looked so grim right there. And you have Ryan Clark of ESPN out there calling for them to just shut down the women's bantamweight division as a whole. And you see a lot of people agreeing with that. And then a few days later, they make this signing and drop this news. And it just injected a bit of blood and, new blood and life into this weight class that really seemed grim after Pennington's win. So that's big for the UFC. We'll get into, I think, the weight cut and how confident we are that Kayla Harrison can actually make 135 pounds. But from the UFC's perspective, this is great for Kayla. At the end of the day, the Cyborg fight, that would have done a lot for her legacy, but what would mean more if she can go in there and win that UFC title and lure Amanda Nunes back? I think that's a bigger fight for her than the Chris Cyborg fight. And ultimately, this is what's going to enhance her footprint in the sport, her legacy, and all those things. Like the PFL stuff, she had just been spinning her wheels there for a little while, and I think this is going to give her new motivation, new drive, a new crop of opponents that can be consistent. If she can make that weight properly and effectively and healthily, and we can see her fight 2-3 times a year in this division, I think Kayla Harrison's trajectory and star power in the sport is going to go up in great magnitude. She's got all the attributes from the personality, the mic skills, all those things. She's still developing as a fighter. I'm curious to see how this Holly Holm fight plays out, because she's obviously, even at 42 years old, significantly better than a lot of Kayla Harrison's previous opponents. So yeah, I think it all kind of worked out for the best for all parties involved. It's disappointing we don't get that Cyborg fight. I think that's really the biggest downside. And as Nolan alluded to, this is a big loss for PFL because, well, they signed Francis Ngannou, as Go said there. He hasn't fought for them, and there's no sign he's fighting for them anytime in the near future. Kayla Harrison to the UFC is a legitimate asset and one they're going to be able to implement very quickly. So I'm interested to see how this all plays out. But the weight cut, I think, for all of us is the big question moving forward.
Definitely. Let's go back to Nolan. Nolan, I wanted to ask you, do you think she leaves tougher competition behind than what she's going to? So basically, the two big guns are Pacheco and Cyborg. And in the UFC, you know, you got quite a few former champions there, and Pena, Holm, and Tate, and Kellen Vera, Irene Aldana, the current champ, Pennington, the possible return of Amanda Nunes, title contender, title challenger Jermaine Durandam is even coming back. So what are your thoughts? This one's kind of tough because of, you know, like I say, that 1-2 punch that's over at PFL versus all these others.
Yeah, I mean, she leaves behind singularly difficult challenges, more difficult maybe than what she's going to get in the UFC. But I think overall, part of this is the longevity, right? She's going to be challenged until she leaves the UFC likely. So I think in the short term, sure, like a Cyborg, maybe a tougher fight outside of, you know, Amanda Nunes coming back than she's going to get in the UFC. Yeah, I think you could certainly make that argument. But for me, I mean, beyond that, right? Say she were to have fought Larissa and then she fought Cyborg, like that's it, you know, unless you're doing rematches or whatever, or somebody totally comes out of left field or somebody jumps from another promotion. I mean, those were the two fights that she had there. Whereas now, I mean, you go down the line, you got Holly Holm, you got Pennington, you have Juliana Pena. You know, you have, if Amanda Nunes does decide to come back, if this does intrigue her enough to come out of retirement, there's obviously a fight that, depending on how the circumstances unfold in the next year or so, could end up being pretty damn massive for the UFC at the end of this year or early next year. So I think, sure, like the Cyborg fight, that sort of challenge doesn't necessarily exist for Kayla right now in the UFC, but long term, I mean, there's just tenfold as many difficult challenges in the UFC than there is in PFL.
Goes, you know how MMA fans, and to be fair, MMA media, the fighters themselves, all of us, right? We can have short-term memories. Let's not forget, Cyborg was also a free agent who chose to re-sign with Bellator. So perhaps Kayla can say, hey, look, I did my part in trying to make this happen a while back.
Yeah, maybe you could do that, but I think we've all just kind of moved past that situation, and now having them both there in the same room, it's just kind of odd, you know, that the fight didn't happen. And there's so many things moving forward that I think need to be answered from Kayla Harrison, and we'll see. You know, I think there's great points to be made on both sides. I think if she would have stayed at the PFL, she could have done some good things short term, right? Because we don't really know exactly what would be beyond those two fights. But long term, you know, she'll go to the UFC and she'll have a lot of good opponents. But I don't know that. I think a lot of it hinges on whether Amanda comes back.
Mm-hmm. And Mike, don't
and
we?
I will say it's important to note too. Like PFL getting rid of their women's featherweight division couldn't have come at a better time for them. So it does make me wonder if we'll hit a point where all of the heavier women's talent is in the UFC. Like, could Chris Cyborg make a return? She doesn't seem, I know it's kind of tough because she seems to not necessarily manage her own social media accounts, but there's definite frustration being expressed pretty openly, you know, from her Twitter account, saying things like, hey, Dana, sign me. Like, let's do this in the UFC. She seems to be chirping Don Davis's account all the time. So, I mean, who's to say that these fights can't happen in the UFC again? I think from things I've heard, it seems like Chris is open to having dialogue with the UFC should she hit free agency again. I know she's kind of hinted she might not have a lot left, but let's not necessarily rule out either that either her or Pacheco could find themselves fighting Kayla Harrison in the UFC sometime in the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Mike, what I was going to ask you was, part of the praise that we heap on Cyborg is, hey, you did it at Strikeforce, you did it at Bellator, you did it at UFC. So in a way, you know, I'm not trying to be the Harrison cheerleader here, but maybe we could applaud her. She's trying to basically replicate, I guess, what Cyborg did. I did my thing at PFL. I won 2 titles. Now let me see if I can conquer other territories.
Yeah, and I think one of the comments in the chat here was like, if Kayla wins, the UFC Women's Bantamweight title, where does she rank among like the greatest female combat sports athletes? 2 Olympic gold medals in judo, 2 PFL championships, and now this. That would obviously be a huge legacy enhancer. And the
Yep.
Cyborg win would have been significant for her too, but I'm sure this was a calculated risk because, as Goes kind of laid out in his first answer, like maybe you could have done the Cyborg fight and the Pacheco fight and then comes over. Well, what if she loses one or both those fights? Then you're kind of screwed, right? And you're painting yourself in a corner. You've depreciated your value significantly to the UFC, and then maybe this doesn't happen and they don't want you. So that last loss to Pacheco was obviously not great. I think a lot of people understood it. You're giving an opponent 3 cracks to beat you. She had done 3 straight seasons and I think was kind of mentally and physically worn down and maybe just didn't have that motivation, but she took the year off. She came back and beat the hell out of Aspen Ladd and kind of recovered some of her value there. So I think this is a good time to do that. And yeah, if she can, all these questions are going to wash away if she gets that UFC belt and starts running this division. She's probably going to make more money than she was in PFL if she starts getting a position where she's the champion with pay-per-view points and stuff. So all the upsides are really there. You didn't even know for a fact the Cyborg fight would happen, right? Like there was some games going on. They wanted to do it on the Saudi Arabia card, but Cyborg had booked the boxing fight like just last weekend. Could she turn around? There's just a lot of crap going on behind the scenes. So I don't blame Kayla or her team for kind of just assessing the lay of the land and feeling like this option had the most upside. But it only has upside if she can make this weight, right? Because it seems like 145 is dead and gone as far as the UFC weight class for women. If she can't make 35 and do it consistently, things get really tricky, right? Like then how do you use her if you're the UFC? Kind of back yourself into a corner a little bit, and as does she. So this 135 thing is going to be the talk of the town going into UFC 300. We're all going to be hyper focused on that for UFC 300 weigh-ins, and then we'll kind of see how it pans out from there. But I think all of us have seen Kayla Harrison in person one time or another, and she is not a small woman. So to see her making that weight, you wonder how much she's going to lose from an energy, effectiveness standpoint, all these things. And obviously Holly Holm is a physical beast, even at 42 years old. So that's kind of the most compelling thing here.
Yeah, definitely. We have to move on, but I did want to say one last thing. You're right. I think she can make it, but will she be effective? Like, I felt like we got a lesson in that with Pitbull Frady trying to become a champ. And I thought, and I think a lot of people thought he would probably have not his way, not to disrespect Pettis, but just basically dominate him, I guess is what I thought. And he just didn't look like himself, man. And even Frankie Edgar, I don't know if he did it too late in his career, but I thought 35, that's his weight. He's gonna kill it, but maybe waited too long or what. But
there's been lots of examples of people doing these kind of one extra step weight cuts, like Kenny Florian down to 145. He was effective there. He still fought for a title, but you just wonder what you're going off. I mean, Kayla Harrison is obviously the ultimate professional, been cutting weight forever. I think she will hit 136 on the scale at weigh-ins, but how does she look there and how does she recover for the fight?
Misha Tate not too long ago too, and that didn't really go too well. There's a lot of stress, that comes from the moment, a new organization, biggest card you can imagine. That's like Mike said, you can make the weight, but you got to be effective at it. And I think those are all answers that are going to be, those are all questions that will be answered in one of the toughest environments you could possibly dream up.
She's 33 years old. I guess she's right. The time was right. You got to just get going. John R. So Facebook and YouTube, your chats are available to us. The better stuff gets mentioned here on the show, whether it's a question or a comment. So try and make it a good one. Help me out here with your spelling and grammar as well, because otherwise I look like the fool. But look, John R. says, Kayla is boring AF. We know what that means. Arm bars and backpacking, couldn't care less. She's below Nunes, Cyborg, and Shevchenko, Rousey in their prime. She's just a big girl. Man, bro, I couldn't disagree anymore with you. She moves the needle. Like, she really was a star over there. And I expect her, if she can come over and get a win. You remember that big splash that Ben Askren made, even though he went 1-2 when he beat Robbie Lawler, and then he said, I think something like, hey, Dana, I thought the competition was good over here. Or when Chandler knocked out Hooker. I think, right away she can become something pretty special. So I would disagree with you, John R. But like I said, keep them coming here, and I'll try and read as many as we can. As we can. But we're gonna move on. We spent a lot of time on this topic, but it deserved it. This was a huge signing for the UFC. Kudos to them. And we move on. So look, UFC 300 has added 3 fights since our last weekly SBC show. That's right. We do it every Mondays here, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. So you can always count on us. All right. But since then, 3 have been added. Harrison versus Cyborg. We just mentioned it. Lopez versus Sodiq Yusuff. And Jessica Andrade versus Marina Rodriguez. Sorry, not just Lopez. He's not a Brazilian soccer player. He's Diego Lopez. I got to say the whole name. All right. That's 11 fights total. Now what, though? Tapology has listed Edwards versus Muhammad as a rumored fight on their website. So, it's not like official. We haven't really heard it from the UFC, but that would make 12. This could be arguably the best top-to-bottom card we've ever seen. How would each of you round out this card? What would be your finishing touches? We go to you.
Well, the low-hanging fruit. If you go Chandler McGregor, then I think you have an absolutely epic card. I mean, imagine all the intrigue that UFC 300 brings just alone. You add those two, and it becomes a Conor McGregor fight week. That is amazing, and I think you're pretty much set at that point. That card would give you that good mixture of fights that matter and then fights that are just kind of fun. They're intriguing. If you add Muhammad and Edwards, I think because it's felt like such a slam dunk and something that should have happened, it gives you that feeling of maybe like they went with plan B. You waited this long. And when you have that feeling, it just makes you think, what did I miss out on? What was it that they were trying to get and didn't get? It gives you a completely different feeling. So if they were to add that one, then I do think you need maybe one more fight to kind of cushion that a little bit. But this is an epic card, man. It needs something really good at the top. And I think maybe Chandler McGregor would probably set them straight. If not, you probably need 1 to 2 more.
All right. How about you, Mike Bond? You're in the matchmaker room. How would you add your finishing touches to what you've already seen?
I mean, I guess it depends if we're being realistic or pipe dreams here, right? Like Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler, of course, would be the perfect main event for UFC 300. I think people have thought that since we became fully aware, when this card would be, timing and stuff. Like Conor has wanted to fight on this card. He said he will, but as I've mentioned on the show multiple times, as we've talked about UFC 300, Conor McGregor ain't going on a pay-per-view that could potentially have 3 title fights on it. Like he's not sharing pay-per-view points with Justin Gaethje, who has talked an incredible amount of shit about him in recent years. Zhang Weili and whatever other championship fight they may put on there. It's just not going to happen. So that seems like absolutely pie in the sky stuff with Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler getting on this card. I think it's more likely to remain in June when it's kind of initially being targeted for. So with that said, I think the fight that is most likely, and we know the UFC is kind of working towards it and seeing what can be figured out, is Dricus du Plessis versus Israel Adesanya, or maybe Khamzat Chimaev, whoever they can get to work out. If Dricus can turn around and he's healthy and stuff, I know he stayed around here in Canada for a few days after the fight. He said he wasn't going to get any MRIs or anything done here. He was going to wait till he went home to South Africa, where he has been for a few days now. We saw that amazing reception he got and everything there. So I think if he is healthy, if he is ready to go, they're going to try their best to get Dricus du Plessis against Israel Adesanya, which to me would be a perfect main event for this card. We have the history between those two. We have the build, the in-cage face-off, just everything that's gone back and forth. Makes a lot of sense to me. We can have the argument about whether Israel Adesanya deserves a title shot, all things considered. I think he's a big enough star and done enough in his career that it does warrant it. The storylines there just makes a lot of sense for this UFC 300 event. So that's the one I'm kind of circling for, hoping for. I think that would make a very satisfying conclusion to this card. You'd probably get one other prelim that's similar to what we've got on there so far, maybe featuring a former champion, someone who is undoubtedly ranked. And I think you have your nice 300 card there. So that to me is the way to wrap this up. I know what the UFC wants. It's just a matter of all the things coming together, and timing and money and health and all that stuff. If they can't do this, I'm curious to see where this ultimately goes, because your options are a lot thinner. And I think they have read the room. I would be surprised at this point if we do get Bilal Muhammad versus Leon Edwards on this card. I think that's more likely to go to the UK in July if they do a pay-per-view there. But if worse comes to worse and they get real desperate, that might be your main event. But I think they're going to do everything in their power to avoid that and get something else, probably Dricus versus Izzy.
If it was, Mike, would it be a letdown in your book?
If it was Leon and Bilal?
Yeah.
I think so. Not to say that's not a great fight and everything, but come on, man. Like, we can be honest here. I think we all do like Bilal Muhammad. He's been very generous to MMA Junkie with his time and stuff, but having him as the UFC 300 main event, I think would be a very polarizing move to the fan base. So I just can't see that doing them. I mean, they've gone from that potentially being on the card to potentially headlining to now it seems like it might not be on this card at all. And I think that's the UFC taking the temperature of their fan base and realizing that's probably not the best move.
All right. Nolan King, how do you top off this card?
Yeah, it's gonna, like Mike said, it's gonna be something kind of special, and I think that Dricus and Israel do check those boxes. For me, the other fight was Israel versus Alex Pereira for the light heavyweight strap, but the fact that Rio pay-per-view is just a few weeks after UFC 300, as somebody that's trying to logistically put all these pieces of the puzzle together and kind of see what the UFC is thinking, to me, I'm not really sure that there's another fight involving a Brazilian fighter that could necessarily headline a pay-per-view right now. That would line up timing wise there. So Alexander Pantoja's already said he's going to be on that Rio card. So I'm assuming that will be the co-main. So kind of ruling Alex Pereira out of UFC 300. Israel Dricus just seems like the layup sort of fight. It's a big main event. I think that paired with the depth, like obviously the thing that's going to stick out in people's brains when they think about UFC 300 that made it special is that depth. Barring McGregor coming back against Chandler, which like Mike said, I think is pretty far-fetched. The depth with a very, very solid, heated rivalry sort of middleweight title fight atop it. I think you can justify that whole package as being a really, truly special night in MMA history. Whereas I feel like Bilal versus Leon is kind of an average, just, pay-per-view headliner. It is what it is. It's something we could have seen at UFC 183. We could have seen it at UFC 211. We could have seen it at any of these events that aren't around the hundreds, right? So I think that would be kind of a letdown for people to kind of get something that didn't really necessarily feel like the cherry on top of the cake here. So let's see what Dricus is up to. If he's healthy, I obviously don't want him to rush it and just jump into a title fight and then we get the not a great version of him. But that one just seems like the easy fight if all these other little intangibles line up. Dricus versus Izzy would be a hell of a UFC 300 headliner, in my opinion.
6-fight main card, Nolan, or just the standard 5? What do you think?
I mean, we're talking about if they go with depends on how many title fights, right? Mm-hmm. If it's going to be 3, 4, 5 round fights, I think we might be in trouble. If it's a couple or I guess 3 is kind of the under over, right? Like if there's 3 on there, you can kind of get away with it. 4, you're starting to really push it, in my opinion. So we've certainly pulled our fair share of all-nighters in the media space, and I think that one we would probably be looking at like 6 a.m. turnaround time. And some, the viewer experience, if all those fights went the distance, you'd be probably watching it close to 3 a.m. So hopefully we don't get into the PFL pacing sort of territory here. We saw what happened a couple of years ago when they put all those title fights, those 5-round fights on the main card. Obviously, I think with this being all these fights having such magnitude, can't really complain or bitch about the time. But just as a viewer experience, I think the UFC is smart enough to not kind of overdo it and do something crazy like 5-round fights or something. So hopefully not.
All right, so some of the layups are obviously Gaethje and Holloway, the Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan. I don't see that not being on the pay-per-view. Edwards and Muhammad obviously would make it. Izzy, DDP, McGregor. So we kind of have a good layout. I just have one question for you guys because we're a little behind. What would be the opening fight on the pay-per-view? Like, what's the one that just really you think sets the tone? These guys will not disappoint, or gals. What do you think, Mike?
Holm. No, just kidding. I think it's probably Prochazka and Rakic. I think Prochazka is a nice way to open it. Rakic, give or take, he can sometimes have some slow fights, but have you ever seen Yuri Prochazka in a boring fight? No. So I think he's a pretty safe bet to open. Then I think you go to Oliveira, Sarukian, and then into your 3 title fights. I think it'll still be a 5-fight main card with 3 5-rounders. Maybe I'm gonna give myself that cop out in case somehow Connor and Chandler does end up on this card, which would obviously be a non-title fight, but it would be 5 rounds.
So Harrison and Holm would go on your featured prelims?
I think that makes sense. That's the best way to showcase Kayla Harrison. I think, the entire prelims for this card are going to be on big ESPN. There's no ESPN Plus. I'm sure it'll simulcast there, but nothing exclusive to that. No, ESPN 2. So they're getting start to finish all prelims on ESPN here. So you got a nice platform to build this up on.
What's your opening fight banger on the pay-per-view?
Maybe I'm a softie, but I think Mr. 300, Jim Miller versus Bobby Green, they rarely give you bad fights, man. And so much has been made about Jim Miller being on this card that I think he earned that first fight.
Okay. I was thinking Sarukian and Oliveira, because Oliveira doesn't give shitty fights either. But Nolan, what do you think?
No, that's what I was going to say. I think sometimes staggering the importance factor, like obviously Yuri and Rakic could be a lot of fun too, but I think really Charles obviously captures a lot of people's attention. He's got a huge following. He's got fans, probably one of the more internationally respected and liked fighters. It's not just Brazil. It's not just one country. It's like, I think everybody kind of has fallen in love with Charles Oliveira. So kicking off with that, kind of setting the tone, getting people locked right away. Obviously there's pretty high stakes in that fight as well. That's probably what I'd go with. But man, honestly, even having this conversation and just going over the Tapology lineup, like it goes to show you kind of the spoils of, just the amount of riches here. We're very much spoiled, and it's kind of funny, right? Because I felt like for a while there, people were kind of shitting on this card a little bit, especially with 299 being as stacked as it was and kind of having a fuller lineup before 300. But regardless of what we get at the top of this card, man, this is going to be something special from the first night of the first fight of the night all the way up. This is already pretty crazy.
I agree. It's pretty sick. I think we're just being a little picky. We do need either that main event or if it's the title fight, whatever it is, but top to bottom, it's pretty money. Look, we're halfway through this live show. We do it every Monday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. So join us for the ride. And this has been going on for a few years now, folks. So if you share the same sentiment as Alex J. Grossman in our chat, he says, this podcast makes my world so much better. Much love from the ATL. Then please share, retweet, subscribe, DM this to your pals that also love MMA. This is for all the hardcores. We discuss all the big topics here, and we're going to continue here. But if you want to leave a comment or question, I'll try and get to as many as we can. UFC 298, 299, and 300 are all pretty much done. Everyone will focus on the main event and the co-main event. We always do, right? We always take our eyes to the top of the card. But what fight do you believe will carry a lot of weight, except it's kind of buried with all the hype given to the bigger names? Mike, you lead off, man. What do you think? What's good out there?
There's a lot of good options. Both these cards are pretty phenomenal, but the one, I guess, just in the nature of this question, trying to pick something that is somewhat under the radar, I guess I will pick Mateus Gamrot versus Rafael Dos Anjos from UFC 299. Just kind of interesting on both sides, right? Like, look where Gamrot was. He was the backup fighter for the Abu Dhabi fight originally, doesn't get selected. And then now lightweight, it just seems like there's maybe like 3-4 people that could be ahead of him in the queue, right? Like obviously the winner of Charles Oliveira versus Arman Sarukian is right there. The winner of the BMF fight between Gaethje and Holloway. Both these winners seem like they would probably be in front of Gamrot in the queue here, which is unfortunate for him, right? Because he seems so close. He's got quality wins. You can judge them, how they went down, the very close fight with Sarukian, the injury with Fiziev, but he's a very good fighter and he's done a lot of good work here. So to see him kind of taking a matchup that none of us really expected, mainly because Rafael Dos Anjos said multiple times that I would only ever go back to lightweight if it was for like a money fight or something that's going to get me a title shot. I guess maybe he thinks that beating Gamrot would do that for him, but I just don't really think any of us saw this as like the natural step forward for Gamrot in terms of like his path to the title. So this was a random one to me, but it has obviously significant importance. Like if Gamrot goes out there and really puts it to RDA, I don't know how you can really ignore him in that title conversation, but we know how lightweight works, these big names. Of course, you want to put Islam Makhachev in the biggest fights possible. And I just look at those 4 fighters that I mentioned previously from those other fights, and they all just feel like they have the inside track on him. So I hope maybe Gamrot can do something special there to give him some cushion behind his name and stuff. And if RDA comes back and derails that and gets a huge late career win, I mean, who's to say kind of where he goes given his history in the sport. So that's the one I'm kind of circling here.
RDA is a gangster, man. He's done well at lightweight, welterweight, and the best thing about him is his fights don't suck. He always pulls the best out of you. This will be a great opportunity for Gamrot if he can get past RDA. All right, so how about you guys? Nolan, you're up next. What's a great fight that's buried is what I'm trying to say out of 298, 299, and 300.
It's kind of strange because I feel like Merab Dvalishvili versus Henry Cejudo is not necessarily getting the love that it should. I mean, to me, it's a pretty clear-cut #1 contender fight in arguably the UFC's strongest division right now, and it's on the least stacked of the 3 pay-per-views that we mentioned. So the fact that this isn't necessarily getting the same sort of spotlight as some of these other fights, it's a little surprising to me. I think Merab's actually been doing a phenomenal job of promoting himself with those videos. I don't know who necessarily was behind those, but those have been hilarious. I think he's kind of twisted or U-turned a lot of people's opinions of him. Some of the trolls, the commenters that have been talking a lot of smack to him in recent months as he's called for the title shot, as he's kind of gone back and forth with Henry Cejudo. So all the promotion, all the cringe talk and comedy videos aside, this is a very important fight. It's a very good fight. I'm having a tough time deciding who I think is going to win. And ultimately, to me, it's kind of, I get it. I get why they did O'Malley versus Cheeto, but at the same time, it does feel like Merab was the guy that should have gotten the next shot if we were going off merit. So this is a really risky fight for him too. Like he could very much go out there and lose to Henry Cejudo. There's no question in my mind that Henry's capable of beating Merab, and Merab's capable of beating Henry. It's just a matter of who's going to come out better that night. And will there be a title shot on the line? Will this be a title eliminator? I think it should be, but we know the UFC doesn't always necessarily go off of merit, as we're seeing with the UFC 299 main event. And either one of these guys, though, present really difficult challenges for the winner of that matchup stylistically, whether it's O'Malley or Cheeto to kind of have to go in there with the grindy sort of relentless wrestler on paper seems like a big challenge for them. So I know 298's good, 299's fantastic, 300's fantastic. So I get why this is being overshadowed despite their name recognition and the importance. But I just definitely wanted to highlight that one because it does deserve a little bit more credit than it's getting.
For sure. Yeah.
And we just ran a story on MMA Junkie a few minutes ago with Henry Cejudo saying if he loses this one, he might retire. So this could be the last we see of Henry Cejudo. So added stakes there.
All right. How about you
guys?
guys?
He could unretire right after.
For me, it's UFC 299 MVP and Kevin Holland. Big mouth against arguably bigger mouth, right? Someone's mouth's got to close in this one. I love this signing by the UFC. And you could tell they understand Michael Venom Page by the way they booked him. I think the guy can make them a lot of money. They matched him up against a perfect opponent, in my opinion, in Kevin Holland. And there's a few other fights like this that I think we would love to see MVP in. The pre-fight for this would be absolutely hyped. And then the fight itself could be potentially bonkers. I mean, look, Michael Venom Page, you've seen some of his knockouts. You've seen Kevin Holland. He doesn't back down. He's going to stand right in front of you. It's going to be high-level striking. To me, MVP has always been a guy that he's a Bellator fighter, but he always had kind of a UFC persona. And I feel like he's going to fit in perfect here. And I think this will be a banger of a fight.
Guys, about a year ago at this time, Aspinall was still recovering from a knee injury. DDP was huffing and puffing his way to 3-0. No one thought Alexa Grasso could take down Valentina Shevchenko. So a lot can change. Out of the names that you guys just threw at me from these big fights that you guys are looking at, can any of them be a champion in 1 year? What do you think, Mike?
Certainly, yeah. I think the winner, as Nolan dropped there, of Merab and Cejudo is more than capable just because bantamweight is so volatile. We know how good these guys are. If Sean O'Malley stays the champion, they're both essentially nightmare matchups for him in terms of the wrestling and the grappling. So I think those two definitely have a very solid chance there. And, I think Gamrot, it's going to be a very hard road for him. But if he can continue to string together the wins, I do think he is good enough. If he gets in a championship fight, like, he can win.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Nolan?
Yeah, I mean, out of those three fights, I think Merab or Henry are the only two really within one arm's reach. The other guys, I think, would have to rack up a few. But Gamrot being in the backup fighter position, obviously, having to fight again without the title fight isn't great for him. But it does show that the UFC respects him enough to put him in that position. So I would say a win over a former champion in RDA should put him certainly in the conversation. So lightweight's kind of a bit of a logjam right now.
Goes, I know you haven't given out who you think might win, but MVP saying I'd love to throw down against Leon Edwards, and that sure would be fun to watch them stand and trade. I don't know if he merits getting a title shot off of one win, but what do you think, man? Could he be a champion, or do you have a name of someone that could come out of nowhere and in 1 year be a champ?
That would be pretty difficult, for MVP. I mean, he'd have to do something. I mean, even if he did something phenomenal like that flying knee, right? You'd still have to jump a line. But that would be an interesting scenario, but I just don't think it's feasible. And I think they know what they have with MVP. I think there's some fun matchups that they're going to try and make. And if he can gather up wins along the way while doing that, then maybe you could talk about a title run. But to just jump like that, I don't think they would do it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Joseph Boza says, Sugar Sean is unproven as champion. I think Merab or Henry can beat him too. Denial 218 in the chat says MVP versus Wonder Boy if he wins, or the winner of Ian versus Jeff. Man, Ian Gary catches a lot of flack, but being undefeated and kind of being exciting, you never know where he might be in 1 year. But boy, that guy, he's got a lot of haters. Maybe that's good. They say if you ain't got haters, you ain't popping. Anyway, topic number 4. It was announced during the UFC 297 broadcast that Frankie Edgar would be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in 2024. He will be going into the modern wing. And let's take a look at the UFC's promo. I think they did an excellent job.
Until November 2010, the UFC's lightest weight class was 155 pounds. Frankie joined the UFC in February of 2007 as a 5'6" athlete.
Frankie Edgar drew people in a way that no one really had before. He was such an every man's type of fighter, a blue-collar guy. Wasn't the biggest or the scariest in the division, but that was part of what made him so compelling to watch.
Undersized, always the underdog. Everyone could see themselves in Frankie. Frankie was really the first fighter to prove that size wasn't the most important thing in a fight.
Fought at 155 pounds. He walked around at 155 pounds. He fought guys that were towering over him, were so much bigger than him, but Frankie had that dog in him, man.
The way that Frankie Edgar fought captured the hearts of fans around the world and garnished the respect of all of his peers.
You cannot break him, or you will never get Frankie Edgar to quit.
You cannot coach a fighter how to have the intestinal fortitude to rise to the occasion, to battle adversity inside the octagon.
Oh, big right hand! Frankie's in trouble.
To rise to the occasion and not only compete well, but to win.
Frankie right back up to his feet.
He's all heart. He's made of iron.
Uppercut by Edgar. Edgar looking for the finish. Bader's in trouble.
The 3 fights that he had with Gray Maynard, I mean, they were just some of the best fights that ever took place in the UFC.
And he's got nails.
But Frankie Edgar beating BJ Penn was the moment that the world realized what they had in Frankie.
At that time, BJ Penn was considered to be one of the pound-for-pound best fighters in the entire world.
He was giving him size and fury. Strength was on the wrong end of the experience equation. Frankie Edgar beat him.
Beat BJ Penn not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Frankie Edgar finishes the legend BJ Penn!
To me, that is what cemented his legacy.
Frankie Edgar has been fighting at a world-class level for 15 years and still competing against some of the best fighters in the world.
he was in the top 5 from 55 to 45 to 35.
Big knockdown for Edgar! Frankie Edgar by knockout!
Whatever weight class he competed at, he was always at the top, fighting, for titles.
He inspired people through his performances. He inspired people with the way that he carried himself inside the octagon and outside the octagon. This guy was a champion through and through.
Has always been respectful, never decided to take that route of becoming a heel. Definitely a family man.
Frankie's such a legend for the East Coast MMA scene and such a big pivotal part in getting it legalized in the state of New York.
Just an all-around great ambassador for the sport.
He is the epitome of a champion.
This is about as clear of a Hall of Famer as a Hall of Famer gets.
Frankie, the answer, Edgar!
There you have it. All right, great stuff from the UFC, and of course, cold coffee, always ready with that B-roll. So, guys, listen, the former UFC lightweight champion had decorated career, and this acknowledgement is well deserved. We can all agree on that. I want to know from you guys, what moment in his career best defined his greatness in your eyes? Nolan.
I think 3 moments that are kind of one. I mean, the Gray Maynard trilogy, which was highlighted there, was just fantastic. One of the best in UFC history. Gray Maynard, kind of an underappreciated fighter within his own right. But yeah, man, I mean, if you want to learn about Frankie Edgar, if you didn't get to see his career, if you kind of only have read about him or you haven't been able to contextualize his run as champion, I would go back and watch those fights, because to me, I think you could kind of see who Frankie Edgar was. It was on full display through that trilogy. His comeback, the fight at UFC 125, just that was a really special, some special moments in each one of those fights. Just if you're a fan of just watching two guys, throw down and have a great fight, you'll love those ones if you haven't seen them. And then you'll kind of see that dog that's inside Frankie Edgar that made, I think, everybody that watched his fights really truly appreciate him. His kind of underdog demeanor, back up against the wall, kind of a smaller lightweight that had all the heart in the world. And so this is just a first ballot Hall of Fame selection by the UFC. I know they're playing catch up when it comes to getting, all the worthy former champions, former stars in the Hall of Fame, with only a few inductions per year. But this is a no-brainer, and I'm super happy for him, especially coming out of retirement last year to be part of this class coming up here. Just super well earned from the answer.
Mm-hmm. Goes, how about you, man? Was there one moment that defined him the best?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great one that Nolan took. And Gray hit him with everything but the kitchen sink, and he just kept coming forward, and it kind of shows what Frankie Edgar was to deal with. But for me, I think the fights with BJ Penn early on, maybe not that last one, but early on, the first two, when you look at the strategy implemented, the game plan, Frankie Edgar just gave us so many different looks throughout his career, so many different ways to win a fight, that he absolutely 100% deserves this moment to be in the Hall of Fame, and to do it over such tough competitors. I mean, look at all the former champions that are on his hit list. It's pretty damn amazing, over multiple weight classes. And he does stand-up comedy. How crazy is that? We got to see that live, and he was good at that too. So props to him, man. Great fighter and a great representative of our sport.
Mm-hmm. I thought Sarah McMahon outdid him on that night, Goes, but you're right. They did do some comedy. What's that?
Well, he had to take away from his moment.
Yeah, well, all right. Sorry about that. All right, how about you, Mike? What did you think was a defining moment for Frankie Edgar? I know he had many, but maybe there's one that stood out for you.
Yeah, these two guys nailed it. I think those are the most prominent examples. I guess one that's maybe slightly more underlooked is his quick turnaround after he got knocked out by Brian Ortega with that vicious elbow. He fought Cub Swanson about 5 weeks later. Everyone said it was a horrible idea, but they needed a big fight for a card in Atlantic City. He's obviously got the ties to New Jersey and everything. And he came back 5 weeks later, despite all the questions about concussion protocols and all these things. And he essentially beat the brakes off Cub Swanson, the only fighter to beat Cub Swanson twice. And I think that kind of depicted him. He's not going to allow the outside noise to affect his confidence, affect his abilities, all those things. And for him to go after getting knocked out, I believe, for the first time in his career and come back and win that fight says a lot about him. So that's something that stands out. Of course, the Gray Maynard fights are more close to the forefront of my mind, but since Nolan mentioned them, I think this is another good example to cite just in terms of Frankie Edgar's greatness. This is a nice one that, you know, we sit here and have like the who should go in debates, the Donald Cerrone re-standardization of what kind of means to be a UFC Hall of Famer. This is one that was never questioned, any doubts, well-deserved, had to come at some point. So it's nice when you do get these choices that are just like very clear layups and obvious and have no questions about it. So congrats to Frankie Edgar in that regard.
Yeah, nice to get DC's approval on it as well. I'm just going to throw a quick one in here. You know, for a while, if you noticed at the very end, it talked about the records he had, the time in cage, or and a lot of times with that comes, well, he goes to decisions, and so he had the longer road to titles. But man, when he socked up Chad Mendes, I remember going, wow, it blew me away. It was in the first round of their fight. They were both gunning for Jose Aldo at the time, and I mean that was really, really good, especially his reaction. He was as happy as I'd ever seen him after a fight. But man, that guy had a lot of great moments. And so real quick, guys, because we only have one topic left, I want to get to it. Who else or what fight should join Frankie Edgar in this year's 2024 class? Nolan?
I mean, I think Cain Velasquez would be a good one. One of the best heavyweights ever. Obviously the timing of this would be interesting as well. So like if they were planning on getting him in the next few years, I think due to his legal circumstances, it might make sense to, try to do it at a time where he's out and is able to attend. Who knows what's going to happen. So I think it's earned. I don't think it's just kind of a sympathetic thing. Like the guy's like top 3 or 4 heavyweights ever, and just an awesome fighter that had a unique part in MMA history too, being the first Mexican American UFC champion. So I think he's on my short list for guys that should be the next of the fighters going in.
And anyone wondering, they have had multiple entries into the modern wing and other wings, so that wouldn't be a hiccup at all. How about you guys?
Dan Henderson's fights in the Hall of Fame, but I think he needs to be there. If you look at his record,
Pioneer wing,
he's very close to being one of the GOATs of MMA if he just picks up a couple wins here and there. UFC tournament he won, a Pride belt he won, Strikeforce belt, that nasty rings tournament. I mean, that guy done just about everything. I think he deserves to be in there.
Yeah, I think he also won a Grand Prix at Pride, and he was a champ at Pride. Amazing resume. How about you, Mike?
I will go with a fight, and I will say Robbie Lawler against Carlos Condit from UFC 195. I think that would make Robbie Lawler the first person to have 2 fights in the fight wing of the UFC Hall of Fame, so a little bit of history there. Obviously, he's fully retired now. The last time he got inducted, it was like right before his final fight. So it'd be kind of cool if I doubt they'll maybe do him back-to-back years, but that fight needs to go in there. Absolutely at some point. There's an argument to be made. It's a better fight than Lawler against McDonald too, which is already in there. So I think that one goes in inevitably. It's just a matter of when.
Mm-hmm. Joseph Boza says the Rousey Carmouche first women's fight should go in. Josh Wallace says Rich Franklin should go in. And D9218 says Hendo KOing Fedor, one of my favorites. That was a great moment. I don't know if it would qualify as a fight that would go in, but anyway, we'll have more opportunities to discuss this because they'll have to, I'm sure more people will be inducted into the Hall of Fame this year. So we'll move on. UFC play-by-play commentator Jon Anik revealed on his podcast, the Anik and Florian podcast, that the UFC fan base has had him ponder his future in MMA. The latest wave of negativity stemmed from UFC 297, more specifically the Dricus du Plessis-Sean Strickland fight. Many fans were critical of the split decision win for the South African. Anik prides himself on being accessible to his followers and fans, but he did say he felt a little turned off by the negativity. A few days later, Anik apologized via social media to his followers, says he needs to be more responsible on an open microphone, and then finished by saying, on to Anaheim. In fact, I was going to read his response, but I think I covered the gist of it. Guys, what did you think of this? This kind of actually got a lot of people's attention, good and bad, a lot of support, and then also a little bit more negativity. Was Anik in any way out of line? Yay or nay, goes?
No, I don't think he was out of line at all. He didn't do it on a UFC broadcast. He did it on his own show, voicing his opinion. That's why people tune in, right? So I don't think he needs to apologize for anything. I think Jon will, he did apologize. He does do those types of things because he's a great guy. He loves the sport. And, anytime Jon Anik feels like he's offended or hurt anybody, he's going to say he's sorry because that's the guy he is. But I think we just kind of caught him in a very vulnerable moment, a moment where he was maybe a little overwhelmed. And that happens to all of us. And all I could say to people in that position is, look, social media, it's got a huge reach, but it doesn't mean that your circle has to have a huge reach. Your circle needs to be small and tight with people that opinions you respect, people you love, and focus on that. People that make valid points, respect you, and you respect them back. And because at the end of the day, like, you are what you answer to, right? And we get so much feedback. Not all of it's negative, a lot of it's good too. But I think you just have to kind of weed through the bad ones and start your day with positivity and try and end it with positivity. Because at the end of the day, Jon Anik's done some incredible things in our sport, and I can't imagine what it would be like to lose him. So hopefully he rethinks that and does stay around for a long time.
Mike Bond, how about you, man? What did you think of everything that transpired? And do you feel like in any way he was out of line? Yay or nay?
No, I don't think he was out of line. I understand, I guess, why he apologized, because he probably felt, a lot of backlash to those comments, and you don't want to necessarily criticize the people who are supporting your work in one way or another, whether they're watching it to criticize you or to support you. But I think you just got to kind of look at this as like a human thing, right? Jon Anik had a human moment from getting a lot of negativity thrown his way, and it's hard to put that filter up at all times, right? Like, we've all been in this game for a while now. We've probably had, some bad things said about us in comments and YouTube comment sections, all these different things. And sometimes your filter doesn't deflect that as well as maybe it should have. And I think the reason Jon Anik got this, I guess, level of feedback, be it positive, negative, for making these comments is because a lot of people in the industry who were defending him, media, fighters, etc., know Jon Anik and know how hard he works. And it's a lot easier to say something about someone when you're anonymous to them, you've never met them, you're just watching them on TV or on a podcast a few hours a week. But people in this industry know how hard Jon Anik works, how much he cares about the sport. So you feel bad for him when he voices these kind of feelings about how down he maybe gets from some of the stuff he gets online. And, whether MMA has like a especially toxic fan base, all that stuff can be things we could get into. I like to think, all sports fans are this way. I cover, the NBA on the side a little bit, and you see some of this stuff too directed towards players and broadcasters and all that stuff. It happens in every sport. It's more of like a kind of situation of where we just are as society as a whole, and people having so much access to social media that it gives you free reign to say basically whatever you want on whatever platform with no repercussions. And sometimes that just takes its toll on you, man. So I don't blame him for having these feelings. I think it's okay for him to voice them. And I hope maybe some people see this and be like, hey, next time I'm about to say some horrific thing in a person's comment section, a fighter after he got knocked out because I lost this bet, and I go to their comment section and say how much they suck, things like that. Like, realize that these are humans with feelings and all this stuff, and maybe think twice before, how harsh you are on them. I get it's part of sports fandom. You want to, voice your thoughts and your frustrations, but just realize, what's coming on the other end of it. And some people do have human reactions, and you could say, stay out of the comments and don't read the comments. But for Jon Anik, he is trying to be better for all of us, be better on his broadcast. And he said himself, sometimes there's things that are really positive for me, constructive criticisms that I do take away that are for the better. And he's trying to find those, but they're harder and harder to resonate with you when you're just going through a field of negativity just to find that one little bit. So we could talk about this for a long time. It is an MMA thing, a culture thing, a sports thing, all these different levels. But I guess kind of the message to go through is when you see someone like Jon, who is doing this for all the right reasons, he doesn't deserve your scorn, I don't think.
All right, Nolan, we go to you for the final take of the week. What did you think of all this? And did you think Jon was out of line in any way? Yay or nay?
No, and I mean, I think there was the clip that went around of Jon kind of speaking about this, but before that clip took place on the show, he had talked about it earlier in the podcast a bit, and he was saying the big thing for him was he likes to interact with people. He likes to, he said Joe Rogan has a huge following. He can't really obviously interact with people. DC can't really interact with people. He's like, mine's getting big, but I'd like to have conversations with people about this. So he was kind of talking about specifically people that he felt like were just there to have an argument or just to say something mean. And like Mike said, we've all seen it. People are going to, it's a shitty part of our society and social media, but people are 10 to 20,000 times more likely to say something mean or let you screwed up than compliment you or say something nice. And I like to think that there's a lot of people out there that don't necessarily use social media to talk at all, but they're just kind of spectators, and that those people do enjoy, kind of have more of a positive viewpoint towards things. Maybe I'm naive for thinking that, but I think it was fair. I think it was open and honest. And like Mike said, or Ghost said, Jon's a good dude. He was probably just trying to smooth things over with that apology. But I think everybody gets frustrated, and that's what we saw there. And yeah, it is difficult to block out the negativity sometimes, but particularly like Mike said too, with the betting, I think that's a big part of it. We see, if you go to any fighter's page, like after they lose, it's just people saying you lost me money and you suck. And guys like Max Holloway, I remember going on his Instagram after he lost to Volkanovski the most recent time, and there's just people absolutely trashing him, telling him that he sucks. And it's not just burner accounts. There's people using their actual names and faces and pictures and stuff. So we could talk another 3 hours about this as within the MMA industry, outside the MMA industry. But yeah, it's obviously a pretty reoccurring theme, I think, in the social media era.
I think what happens is Jon does pour his heart into the sport, into his broadcast, and he's away from his family. He's got his 3 kids, and I think what happens is when the fight card's over, like, I want to celebrate the winners, talk about the fights, and it seems like the first thing in your feed is there is some negativity, and I think that can get to someone who is doing a lot of travel. Granted, we just came off 4 weeks, and then we had the fight card in Vegas and then Toronto, but still the accumulation, right? He said he's 45 years old and he's been doing this for a long time. And then you have to travel. It was cold in Canada, and then you get to Florida and muggy, and you just can't wait to get home and be with your family. And every time you're probably in that Lincoln Town car or the cab or whatever, and you're just scrolling, man, to get to the good stuff, like he says, I want to talk about some of the tactics from the main event or what could be next or whatever. And it's just an onslaught of negativity. I think that's kind of where he's coming from. But somebody in the chat was saying, look, sometimes it feels like the media does crap on fans, and you're not wrong. And the problem is, I think a lot of times we just tend to say fans, almost insinuating like all fans. And I try and be as specific as possible. It is a 5 to 10% of vile fans, a jungle of fans that can be really, really bad. And unfortunately, they can be the loudest. But man, there's some great fans. And there's a lot of great fans, especially on our site, that listen to our podcast, to this show, that read Mike and Nolan's pieces. And we want to thank you all for doing that. And we believe in you guys. And we know that you guys are the majority. But like I say, that 5 to 10% can be pretty heavy lifting, man, at times. Just wanted you guys to know where we come from. So I'm going to try and be better about saying not all fans. For sure, it's not all fans. It's a minority of fans. For the most part, MMA fans are brilliant. And the ones that go to our site, we call them junkies, man. And we refer to ourselves as junkies as well, because that's how much we love the sport. Mike, you want to say something?
No, I was just going to add on to that. I mean, we definitely, everyone, media, fans, promoters, everyone in the space could probably be better off being more positive and stuff. And like you said, a lot of good people, you see some of them in this comment section, like, who are very supportive, watch the sports follow the athletes for all the right reasons, but that vocal minority can take its toll. And my fear is, not everyone is built for this. Not everyone should be built for this. Like, we're really kind of the first generation that has had to go through years and years of this social media wave and kind of experience this type of stuff. People 20 years ago didn't have to deal with this in the same way. And my fear is just that, the people who aren't able to tolerate this for a long enough time are going to get driven out of the sport, especially good ones. Esther Lynn of MMA Fighting is an example, right? Like, she's the best photographer in combat sports history, and the scorn of, fans and just the nature of this beast kind of made her tap out on this. And I'd hate to see that happen to more good people who are making this a better place with their work.
I will say this to the 5 to 10% though. Stop being a crybaby. Honestly, accept the result. Sometimes the better man or woman wins. Sometimes the better team wins. It's not rigged. In the history of sports, has there been shady stuff? Yes, but that's also a minor thing. Sports is all about the way the ref called it, the judge called it, the players, the way they played. They did their best. They're all humans, except that I even saw some of that in the NFL. Man, I mean, that's something I think people need to reprogram themselves.
Save your hate for like something that truly warrants it, right? Like Jon Anik thinking Dricus Du Plessis won a 3-2 fight over Sean Strickland is like the most mellow take I've ever heard. I mean, I thought Dricus won. I think we talked about it last week. Most people did. It was a close fight. So like, it's not like the genesis of this was Jon Anik saying some outrageous, ridiculous thing. But as we know, Sean Strickland has some very passionate fans these days. So maybe he just felt a lot of that. But yeah, if you're people sometimes deserve to be shit on for their opinions and their bad takes. Thinking DDP won a 3-2 fight is not one of them.
Mm-hmm. The block button, the ignore button, they are your friends if you want them. I don't think I've done too many of those, but sometimes it's just like, it does help. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in to Spinning Back Clique. We do this every Monday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Check it out. It's also in podcast form. It'll be out tomorrow. But if you want to catch the video replay so you can see all the cool backdrops, then obviously you can go to MMA Junkie's YouTube page, youtube.com/MMA Junkie video, and you can just start from the beginning in case you kind of got here halfway through. But that's why if you hit that bell, it'll let you know when we're on live. Subscribe tells you about all the great content we have. Like really helps us get this out to more people. And don't forget, we're also on TikTok. I know there's a lot of TikTokers out there. It's MMA Junkie Official. We're out of here for now. Go out and be a champion. We'll talk to you soon.